first question I had for you today was, what was life like in your early childhood? I know the Great Depression happened in the 1930s, so what was life like during that time period?
Well, I grew up in the town of Hominy, which is in Osage County, Oklahoma. Hominy had a population of about 3,000 when I was growing up. And being in a small town, we didn't see the same effects of the Depression as was seen in the big cities. I never knew there was a Depression. My father might have known, but we always had plenty of food. We always had a dairy cow, even living in town. And that was my job to milk it after I got to be 11 years old. But we always had a garden. We had a lot of fresh vegetables, and my dad operated an automobile repair shop, and he seemed to do well. My mother was a beauty operator, so there were two incomes coming into the house. So it was a nice small town experience growing up. In the summer we took off our shoes and our shirts, and we never wore shorts at that time. We always wore khakis. When I was a little guy, we took off our shoes and our shirts and wore overalls. That was all we wore. And we just roamed wherever we need to, anywhere in the town, and there was no problem of safety. We played a lot of sandlot football and sandlot baseball, and it was a nice experience growing up as far as I'm concerned. Being in Osage County, a lot of our schoolmates were Indian, either Cherokee or Osage, and they grew up white. One of my friends, I asked her about an exhibit in the window downtown of Indian footwear and clothing, and I asked her about the moccasins. I said, why did they make them that particular way? And she said, Billy, I don't know. She said, don't you know I'm an Apple Indian? And I said, what in the world is that? She said, I'm red on the outside and white on the inside. So they grew up in a white school with white schoolmates, and they didn't follow the old Osage ways. I've been back up to Hominy for high school reunions, and a lot of the younger Osages up there now are going back to the Osage ways, learning the language, learning the customs, and that sort of thing. The Osage Indians in the 20s were considered the richest people in the world because of oil that was discovered in Osage County, and they had a royalty, and the Osages had made the law that all the tribe shared equally in any income from mineral rights. And so when the tribe organized, they gave each head of the household what they called a head right, and each head right shared equally in all the royalties from the oil that was being pumped in Osage County. can't think of anything else particular about growing up. Everybody played football. If you didn't play football, you were in a band, and I was in both. And 3 days after my birthday was in February, but the draft board allowed me to finish high school. So 5 days after I graduated, I was inducted into the Army down at Fort Sill. I think that was the second time I'd ever been on a train, when I took a train down to Fort Sill. Can't think of anything else particularly relevant about growing up.
My next question I had for you was, in 1939, when the war broke out over in Europe, did it make the newspaper? What was it? Big news in your town?
Oh yeah, it was big news, and also after Pearl Harbor in 1941, there was a tremendous patriotic wave in the community, and a lot of kids in high school joined the services early at 17, and it was considered your patriotic duty to be in the service. I had one friend who played college football at Tulsa and played football for Detroit Lions, and he was very nearsighted, and he kept failing the physicals. He'd go in to enlist, and he'd fail a physical, and finally, the story is, and I believe it's true, knowing the man, he went to take his physical, and he got to the eye exam, and he told the doctor, "Doctor, if you don't pass me, I'm going to beat you to within an inch of your life." And he was a big burly fellow, and I guess the doctor believed him, so he passed him. And so he got into the Navy. I don't know how long he stayed in, but he forced his way in, and that was the attitude among people, that it was your duty to be in the service.
So my next question is, you were drafted in 1944, correct?
Uh-huh.
So had you not been drafted, would you have joined the Army?
I tried to join the naval air service, but it was after I had been classified as 1A, and I was not allowed to enlist in any other service. I had to be drafted. A number of people did join at 17 with their parents' consent, but I never felt like I needed to.
So when you were drafted into the Army, was your parents worried about you? Was your siblings worried about you? What was it like at home?
Well, yeah, they were worried. It wasn't very long after I was drafted that D-Day occurred, and that generated a lot of casualties, and there were a number of casualties in the town, people who were wounded or were killed. So they knew that anybody going into the service had a certain risk. I went to basic training in Camp Fannin, Texas, which is was up near Tyler and Longview, in the piney woods in the middle of the summer. The trees knocked out any breeze that was trying to come through the camp, and it was just miserably hot that whole summer. But many of us who just came out of high school gained weight because of the physical exercise we were taking. We had in our basic training company, we had a few old guys that we had to help along. They were overweight and they smoked and they were married, and they were 21 years old. But we considered them old guys at the time.
So what was, now that you mentioned that, what was like, so the average age was like 18 to 19 years old?
Mostly 18 or 19, right out of high school.
So the old guys were anything over 20?
Yeah, oh yeah, they were old guys.
So what did your training consist of? Was it just running? Was it military drills? What did it consist of?
Well, there were all the military drill exercises. Yeah, we did a lot of running. We did a lot of physical strength, improving our physical strength, climbing walls, lifting weights, that sort of thing. But we had an awful lot of training, classroom training, we had training on weapons, of course, with training about the gas mask, what it would and would not prevent. Gas mask at the time didn't eliminate carbon monoxide, so we were trained that it would prevent tear gas and other gases, but it wouldn't prevent carbon monoxide if you went into a burning building. The tear gas training was you went into a room and they let loose a tear gas container, and you had to walk out of the room then and put your mask on. But you had to experience the tear gas. But there was a lot of classroom training as well as just the physical training. We trained on the M1 rifle, the M1 carbine, the Browning automatic rifle, 30 caliber machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns. We had experience with all of those, so that whenever we were assigned to a division, we'd have some experience with each one of them. Not every company had all of those weapons. When I was assigned to the 89th Infantry Division in North Carolina in September, I was assigned to an anti-tank company. Every regiment at the time had an anti-tank company, and our weapon was a 57, what they called a 57 millimeter rifle. It was like a little artillery piece, but it was 57 millimeter, a lot smaller than the big artillery pieces. But it had a very high muzzle velocity, and the tip of the ammunition had spent uranium in it to make it heavy enough to presumably to penetrate a tank. We never shot one at a tank, but we had that weapon, which was presumably designed for that.
So after basic training and after you were assigned to the 89th, what happens from there? How did you get from America and how did you get over to Europe?
Okay, we spent time training on the weapon. We also had to take training with the 50 caliber pistol, because the gun crew couldn't carry a rifle. We had to wear pistols, so we had to be trained on those too. in late December, we went to Boston by train to get ready to board what used to be a passenger liner. I'm not sure if the whole division got on there, but it was an awful lot of people. And it was a converted passenger liner, and we had bunks down below, 2-layer hammock type bunks. And we went over in January, and it took 5 days, and we had a hell of a winter storm on the way. The ship was coming up, and the bow was coming clear out of the water, and you could hear it bang down. The waves were that intense. And we landed in Le Havre, and then we went by truck to Camp Lucky Strike, which was one of the cigarette camps. They had a number of camps along the coast, which when divisions landed, they'd come there and get ready to assemble and go into combat. And at the time we landed, the Battle of the Bulge was going on. And my suspicion is, or my guess is, that they didn't want a Green Division getting involved in the Battle of the Bulge. So we sat in camp for a month. And finally in March, we entered the combat in Luxembourg, and from there we went on into Germany.
So I have another question for you, because a lot of times I don't ask this question. It's something that I would like to know. So what was it like on the day-to-day? What did you do to pass the time when you weren't in combat? Did you get to know people? What was it like?
Well, we knew all of the I knew everybody in the company almost, just due to interface during the training in North Carolina and the time we were just kind of sitting on our hands in Camp Lucky Strike. It was really cold, snow on the ground when we landed. We had to assemble our own big 30-man tent, which is not an easy job. And there was one little stove in the tent, which didn't warm anything. It was just real cold. By the time we left there, the weather had become much milder. It felt like at the time. Later on we encountered some very cold weather too. That was one of the coldest weathers in European history, winters in European history, as I remember. So day to day, we didn't do much of anything while we were in the camp.
So another thing, did you get any letters, or did you have contact from back home while you were in during this time?
Yeah, we had, I think they called it V-mail. We had to write it on a particular blue piece of stationery, which when you finished it was folded up and made a letter. And we got pretty regular mail. The mail that we wrote had to be censored by our captain or one of the officers. And I saw some of my letters after I came home that they'd been blanked out. Certain sentences had been blacked out. I don't know what was so sensitive about it, but all our letters were censored, letters coming in. We had mail call every day. and my folks and a couple of the girls in high school wrote to me pretty regular.
So before I move on to talking about your combat experience, what type of food did you eat? Because if I was there, I'd be worried about the food.
Well, when we were in camp, there was a mess hall, pretty healthy food. We didn't think it always tasted real good, but we had good food. When we moved down into combat, we didn't have food from our mess hall very often. We used C rations and K rations. But when we first landed, we had a very good mess hall. I had an interesting experience. Nearly everybody had to do KP from time to time. And I was doing KP, doing the pots and pans, and our cook, who was from West Virginia, had a really great sense of humor. And I was doing the pots and pans, and he said, "Hey, Kongable," he said, "your hands are dirty. Come over here and knead this dough." And so I went over and kneaded the dough, and by the time I got through, my hands were real clean. I don't know whether I tasted the bread that day at lunchtime or not.
When they moved you to the front lines, what was the feeling amongst you and your fellow soldiers?
Well, being in the anti-tank company, we rode in a truck which pulled our weapon. And when we first went into combat, our job was to follow the 4th Armored Division. And they would go blazing through these towns, knocking out a few things. And the infantry companies would have to come through and clear the town out if there were any remaining German soldiers. And sometimes there were, and sometimes there weren't. But we were riding in the truck trying to catch up with the 4th Armored Division. We didn't have any combat experience at all until we had the division had the Rhine crossing. At that time, our weapons were stationed at the top of the bluff. The Rhine Valley was a pretty steep valley where the Rhine ran through the country. It was steep on either side, and our weapons were stationed up on the bluff on our side. The infantry companies were to cross in M1 combat boats, which carried 8 people. There were 4 soldiers on each side rowing, and an engineer in the front and an engineer in the stern. And the plan was to make a surprise attack at 2 o'clock in the morning. The first company crossed without incident, but when the second company started to cross, the boats came back for the second company. When the second company started to cross, the Germans had set up machine guns and 20mm anti-aircraft guns in culverts under the road, and right at the water level they had a perfect crisscross pattern, and the E Company, which was the second company that crossed, had I think 85% casualties that night. And our job then was to try to knock out the machine guns and 20mm and anti-aircraft guns. I guess we eventually did. About 5 o'clock in the morning, I remember there was a smoke screen down the valley, and there was no gunfire on either side. And at noon that day, we crossed the river on a pontoon bridge in our truck. Right after we crossed the river, General Patton decided we didn't need any more anti-tank companies, so they put our company on foot as infantrymen, and we had a bazooka in each squad in case there was any tank problems, and there never was. So we never fired our weapon at a tank. We did fire at weapons that were being fired at our troops during the Rhine crossing.
So you never encountered a tank in the whole time you were...
Well, at one time when we were on patrol after we crossed, there was a tank about half a mile away, one of the German tanks, and it was firing, but not in our direction. I don't know what they were shooting at, but we never came into any close contact with a tank.
So I have a question for you. Do you think the reason why you didn't see any tanks was because during the Battle of the Bulge, most of the tanks have been expended attacking?
Well, a lot
troops?
of, I think that's what happened. They used them up in the Battle of the Bulge, and there were very few tanks left, I think. But one thing we really noticed was that the German army never gave up. They were decimated by, bombing raids and close air support, but they were always fighting. They were always fighting. We never knew when we might encounter something. And that experience on the Rhine River was the most glaring example of that. But we encountered fire from German patrols nearly every day till the end of the war.
So I have another quick question for you. After you cross the Rhine and you're in German territory and you're going town to town to town, they spoke German, you spoke English. So did you have a translator so you could talk with the people in the town?
No, we didn't. When we came to a town, once we cleared a town, we went. We appropriated German houses for the troops to sleep in. We told the Germans to get out, and we slept in their houses. Then another company came through to clear the next town, so the companies leapfrogged. But we never counted. I remember hearing a bunch of German children talking one day, but we didn't encounter any Germans that we had to translate from.
Were they, even though you couldn't understand them, or you didn't, were they scared of you? Were they expecting you coming, or
Yeah,
what was it like?
I think they were mostly scared. When we got there and said "Heraus," which is get out, they got out quick. They didn't protest or do anything like that.
So they gave you, because I know in my collection I have a booklet that has like some basic, did you have like a booklet with basic translations?
No.
So moving forward, so what was it, so after the Rhine crossing, you're going town to town to town, I know eventually you get to the concentration camp on April the 4th. So were you expecting to come upon a concentration camp? Was that talked about?
No, we had seen movie news reports about concentration camps, and we knew they were, the Germans were doing that, but we never expected to come upon one. The one that the division, not our particular company, but another company liberated, was at Ordruff, and the guards had abandoned the camp with over 1,000 prisoners a day or two before. So there was no liberation to it except walking into the camp. But seeing the camp was an experience that nobody forgets. The Germans had executed about 50 prisoners and left them laying in the front yard, main yard of the camp. We assumed that these are people who couldn't or wouldn't go on a forced march. They took the remaining prisoners on a forced march up to Buchenwald, which was the mother camp. Ordorf was a work camp, and all the men were being used to excavate tunnels and cavities in the surrounding mountains as a place to put their airplanes and tanks, so the American bombers couldn't get to them. Deep in the mountains, the bombs wouldn't reach them. Besides the dead people in the front yard, there was a shed with about 50 naked, emaciated bodies just stacked up against the wall like logs. And there was a open bonfire arrangement in the yard with about 20 feet square, where they were using where they were burning bodies. They had been burning bodies. There was no fire when we got there, but there were bones and skulls and every part of the human body lying in the fire pit. And outside the camp there was a open pit which they said contained about 3,000, again, naked, emaciated bodies. The Ordorf wasn't a work camp, but it wasn't an extermination camp, but they did a good job of starving and working people to death.
So the remaining prisoners in the camp, they were not in good health. They had just been left there.
There were, as I remember, there were only 2 or 3 prisoners alive when the camp was liberated. They had hidden in the bunks. In the barracks where they kept these people, they slept in wooden bunks 3 levels high, and they slept head and foot in towards the wall. And the bed was pretty deep, and there were apparently 2 or 3 prisoners that just hid back in the bunks when the camp was abandoned. But there were there wasn't any number of prisoners there when the camp was liberated.
So what were you feeling when you're going through this, seeing all this stuff? Did you get overcome with emotion?
Well, yeah, a little bit, but we had seen a number of dead people during our combat experience, starting in Luxembourg. So it wasn't unusual to see dead people, but to see the number, it was was just overwhelming. You just can't believe human beings can treat other human beings that way. And it could only happen in a totalitarian dictatorship like Hitler's and Stalin's. Stalin was probably killed more people, more Russians than Hitler did killing Jews and other people. But we didn't the big impression, the first big impression going into the camp was the smell. The prisoners who had been there, I doubt if they ever had a bath. So the bunks just had a terrible smell to them. I mean, the bunk houses. And of course, the place where the dead bodies, it's the smell of dead flesh. It's something very memorable, very memorable.
So, one last thing on the concentration camp, because we talked a lot about it. What's one thing for the next generation that you would want them to know about the concentration camp?
I would say the fact that the concentration camps occurred was due to the totalitarian dictatorship which was ruling Germany. And my advice to young people would be, there are people in the U.S. who would like to do the same thing and have a president who stays on forever. And it's up to the young people not to let that happen. It's their duty to keep this country free from becoming a dictatorship. And it's not going to be easy.
So, one other thing. So, a lot of people have the impression that all Germans were involved in the concentration camps, but it was mostly just the SS and mostly that function that was doing the camp. So, when the townspeople, they didn't know what was going on for the most part.
They said they didn't, but when the camp was liberated, the generals went to town and had every citizen go through the camp, the town of Ohrdruf, which was nearby. And most of them said, "Oh gosh, we didn't know. It wasn't us. We're not Nazis. It wasn't us." They had to have known that these prisoners were marching through town, going to these jobs excavating caves in the mountains. They could probably smell the camp if it wasn't that far away. I don't think a lot of the German people didn't participate in Nazi activities, but I can't believe that most of them didn't know. Besides the concentration camps, Germany used slave labor all over the country, in factories, chemical plants, repairing the railroads that were bombed by the U.S., manufacturing airplanes and tanks. In Germany, most of the able-bodied men were in the army, and most of the women were home making more able-bodied men, so there wasn't any labor force to operate the German industry. And they had, I think, predominantly Polish and Russian slave laborers, as well as some from Czechoslovakia, Romania, Hungary, down in there. We encountered some from Holland and Belgium. And the slave labor force, I don't know the number, it might have been 1 million. When the war was over, here they are with no place to live, no food, nobody to feed them, and they're, hundreds of miles away from home. So it was a tremendous job by the Allies to take care of these people and repatriate them. After the war, there was a train load of Russians that had been slave laborers that the Allies sent back to Russia. And when the train got to Russia, Stalin decided that these people might be contaminated by Western philosophy. He executed all of them. He was worse than Hitler, and he was executing his own people, not just Jews or gypsies or other people that they considered unfit. And that was the last train that went back to Russia. From then on, the Russians were handled some other way. I don't know what happened.
So how did your company, your division, ever capture any Germans? And if you did capture them, how were they treated?
Well, they were usually sent back with a guard, sent back to the prison camps which had been set up behind the lines. We didn't personally, I don't remember that our company personally captured any Germans, but at the end of the war, the Germans were coming from the front in regimental formation, carrying their rifles. And after they crossed the front lines, they stacked their rifles and went back to a little ways to a prisoner of war camp, which had maybe a couple of strands of barbed wire, but thousands of Germans wanted to surrender to the Americans or the Allies because they knew that they wouldn't live if they were captured by the Russians. I don't know how they were handled after that, but I know that after the war, we went back to Camp Lucky Strike, and our division was operating the camp, and troops were coming back through Camp Lucky Strike to get on a boat to go home, or to get on a boat to go to Japan. And we had German POWs operating the mess halls and cleaning up the camp. And one of the memorable things to me one day was that the Germans had assembled to go back to wherever they were quartered, and they were marching through. It was a whole company of them. They were marching along in perfect step and singing a German song of some kind. But they had a good life once they were prisoners of war, because they ate what the Americans ate. I know there were POW camps back in the U.S. And these were, I think they were Germans that were captured in North Africa. they sent quite a few of them back.
So after Ohrdruf was liberated, and after that, there wasn't much that went on after that for the rest of the war.
No, no, we didn't encounter hardly any resistance from there on.
And one question I forgot to ask you earlier. So how much weight were you carrying when you were marching along? What was like the equipment? How much ammunition did you carry?
Well, we carried ammunition in our belt, and we carried an M1 rifle, and we probably had about 30-pound pack, which had our winter clothes in them when we weren't when it warmed up, and a little ammunition. Not very much. 30 pounds was hardly anything.
Because I know when you watch a lot of movies, it seems like you have endless amounts of ammunition, but that was not the case.
You said what?
So like when you're watching like movies that have to do with World War II and you see the frontline troops, it feels like when you're watching them, they're never running out of ammunition. But you didn't carry that much ammunition with you.
We didn't carry, we carried a number of clips in our belt. And I don't know how they did it, but the ordnance people resupplied us every day if we used up our ammunition. The day after the Rhine crossing, the morning after, there was a truckload of ammunition, unloading ammunition for our guns. Everything's organized in the Army. If the ammunition's used up, it's resupplied very quickly. So we didn't use up very much ammunition, but it was resupplied quickly.
So now the war's ended. Everything's now coming to a conclusion. What is the devastation in Germany? The devastation in France? What does that look like?
Well, it's hard to believe. You've seen the pictures. Some German towns there were just no buildings left. Most of the small German towns didn't have that kind of bombing. They may have had some machine gun from air support or from machine guns used by the troops, but the big cities were the ones that had the most devastation. When we landed in Le Havre, they said that the French people in Le Havre didn't have much love for the Americans because they had bombed it terribly. Le Havre was almost a ghost town, and it was French, which was, at the time, they were on our side.
So you were there, were you part of the I know you were there until about December of 1945, from what I read about, your history before I came. So those couple of months, because the Instrument of Surrender signed on May the 8th. So between May the 8th and December when you leave, what was it like?
Almost right after the surrender, as I was saying before, our division went back to Camp Lucky Strike on the French coast, and our company patrolled the French villages surrounding the camp to keep American soldiers out, because people who were going home were sometimes half crazy about to sample French culture and the women and the food, and we did that for, I think, until September, if I remember right. And in September, I don't know what happened to the whole division, but many of our company and I went back to Austria to be the occupying force in Austria. And when we got back there, our job, Linz, Austria, which is where we went, where a number of us went and where I landed, was right on the Danube River. And that was the border between the Russian zone and the American zone. So our job was to monitor the traffic on the bridge going across between the two zones. And originally we were on the Russian side of the bridge along with Russian soldiers. And we did have an interpreter with us when we were there. I don't know whether he'd studied Russian at home, but he's had become an interpreter for the army. He was a soldier, and relations didn't stay good between us. So wasn't very long till we had our own guard shack on the American side, and they had their guard shack on the Russian side.
So this is the start of like the Cold War tensions and the Iron Curtain in Europe.
Yeah, yeah. And the Russian soldiers were peasants of the lowest order. They were not very smart, and they didn't mind shooting the weapons up in the air and at buses if something happened. And one of the interesting things when we were standing guard, any people that came from the Russian zone, they had some kind of identification papers, and they were always showing us their ID papers. But several of them, when they got to our side, pulled out a little yellow card and said, DDT, DDT. And after the war, there was such a terrible outbreak of body lice that the Americans, and I think probably the other Allied forces, set up checkpoints, and everybody that came through had to have their shirt open, and they blew powder into their shirt, into their pants, and women were not accepted. And then they were given this little yellow card, but that said they had been dusted. They just didn't want to have want to have that experience again. They wanted to prove to us that they had been dusted. But it was that remaining part of the year and until May next year, it was pleasant. We didn't have any strenuous duties other than the standing guard.
So you weren't participating in any denazification of the area or anything like that?
No.
So that was my last question about that. So now the occupying, you go back to the Lucky Strikes camp like you mentioned, and you're loading the boat to go back to America. When you're leaving Europe, how did the war affect you? How did it affect everybody else? Nowadays we call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but back then it was called shell shock. How many people suffered from that?
No one that I know. No one that I know, because our division never got into any really strenuous, really intense battles like the Battle of the Bulge. We had very few casualties in my company. We only had 2 casualties in my company that I knew, and they were bullet wounds. No one was killed. And on the boat, there were probably 3,000 or 4,000 people on the boat going back to the U.S. And everybody had a good time playing poker and listening to music, and a lot of gambling went on, of course, when the GIs are involved in any recreation.
Did you ever win any money?
I'm sorry?
Did you ever win any money in these gambling?
I did when we went back to, when we went from Camp Lucky Strike to Austria, I got into a crap game and won quite a bit of money. But after that, I always lost money.
So when so you're going back, you were greeted very well coming back?
Oh yeah. Well, we when the ship landed, of course there was usually a band and a number of civilians there cheering us. But then we got on a train going down to Fort Sam Houston. And it was there were civilians on the train as well, and people usually wanted to say thank you. When I got home back in Hominy, they'd had soldiers coming back to Hominy for a year by then, so it wasn't any great deal for a great event when I got back there, because it was they greeted most of the people that already had come back to town, but most of my old friends were there, so it was just like being back home.
So how did so I know when you came back there was GI benefits, and you came home to a welcoming country. Did you utilize any of these benefits, the GI benefits, anything like that?
Yeah, my parents had moved to the Panama Canal Zone in 1945, and so after I got home, I stayed there about a month, I guess, and then I went down to the Panama Canal Zone, and I worked for a year, and then I went to junior college in the Canal Zone, and then I came back up to the U.S. to the University of Oklahoma, and I went to school there on the GI Bill. So that was the main benefit that was available to me.
So last question I have for you, for me, is looking back over everything that you went through from start to finish, you know, how did everything affect you? Does it still affect you? Or how did it all end out for you?
I don't think there was any lasting effect other than the fact that I'd have been away from home for 2 years. It was interesting, and can't think of the word for seeing the concentration camp. Horrified, I guess. But it didn't really affect us. I don't know that it had any effect on me, any detrimental effect at all.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to answer all my questions. I know I asked quite a few, probably about 20. But I do appreciate you taking the time to talk with me about everything, and hopefully I was able to, keep it going and everything. Well, I appreciate it, Mr. Kongable.
Well, you're welcome. You're very welcome.